Hello, friends, and welcome to the very first episode of the I Used to Think podcast, a podcast about the stories of people who have changed the way they thought about a certain topic or issue because of an experience that they've had in their life. Today, we will be speaking with my good friend Tynan and how a 2-year trip to Japan changed the way that he saw jazz music. I apologize in advance for any kind of background noise or voices in the background. The walls between my room and my roommate's room are pretty thin, so we're still trying to figure out how to soundproof the room a little better. We'll cover a lot of great questions in this episode, including what makes jazz such a unique genre of music? What is the jazz scene in Japan like? And deeper questions such as what makes music spiritual or even overtly religious? Today's episode is titled Jazz, Japan, and Jesus. I hope you enjoy. Tynan, welcome to the show. We're going to start off with an icebreaker that I had just found on Google 2 minutes ago. If you could be any vegetable, what vegetable would you be?
Any vegetable?
Yes. And I'll let you, I know some people think like a tomato is a vegetable, so I'll let you even define what you think a vegetable is.
It is not animal or mineral. So, what's a vegetable I like and would want to be? I really like artichokes.
Okay. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
You have a nice heart in the middle, but you're very spiny on the outside. I'm coming up with something on the spot, but does that work?
That's actually a great answer.
Okay.
It got very deep very quickly. And I'm assuming you like artichokes.
Yeah.
Okay.
With some mayonnaise.
Oh, that with mayonnaise.
Yeah, so you take off the artichoke, I don't know what they're called, the outside.
The layers, yeah.
And you dip them in mayonnaise, and they're great.
Do you like cook the artichoke first?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you definitely wanna cook them. Yeah.
That's an awesome answer. I'm gonna have to ask that to my next guest and see if they could beat that, but that might be the best one.
Well, when you come first, that's easy.
So you sent me this outline that you had typed up at, you said 5 a.m. as you were mulling over what you wanted to talk about, and your mind came to jazz. You said you've been thinking about that a lot recently. What is your I used to think statement? So I used to think blank, but now I think this in relation to jazz.
Yeah, so I used to think that jazz was boring. But after just different experiences, I find it to be really fascinating, actually. And I really enjoy it now, like I never thought I could before.
How long was this period from when you first, say like the day before you started liking it to like, oh my goodness, I could listen to this. Like I'll make a playlist about it.
Yeah, that's actually kind of hard because I felt like I grew up with not a clear conception of what jazz music was because I never grew up playing piano or playing any instruments or anything like that. So all I knew was the music that my parents shared with me or that was on the radio, and very rarely was it jazz music.
Right.
So actually, going to Japan just 4 or 5 years ago was really my first experience being immersed in jazz more, I think.
If someone were to ask you, the old Tynan, the pre-jazz Tynan, what do you think of when you think of jazz? What would you have said?
Yeah, this is kind of silly, but I would always think of like Kenny G music, like in an elevator, or maybe a Christmas Carol instrumental by him. And nothing against Kenny G, but I just never thought it was that interesting. I never really wanted to listen to it more. It was just nice background music to have on, but that was my idea of jazz at that time.
And to this day, I would even say if I was put on the spot and someone was like, name a sax player, I mean, my mind would immediately go to Kenny G.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure he's a great sax player. I actually haven't listened to much of his music, but I'm thinking a lot of that has to do with just like exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas rolls around and the radio's playing music. Like, I feel like people aren't properly exposed to like what jazz is really about and the artists that represent it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you mentioned Japan. That's a big part of this story. Tell us, when were you in Japan? Why were you in Japan? A little background about that.
Yeah, so just very briefly, I was in Japan for a couple years from 2017 to 19, and I was actually hired through the government to teach English. There's a program called JET, and so that sent me over to Japan in Tokyo, and I worked as an English teacher supporting the teachers at a Japanese high school. And so that was kind of my entry point into appreciation of jazz, although I didn't really know it at the time.
And was it a friend that really started this journey for you? A YouTube video? How did this begin?
Yeah, so it's actually, there's a lot to this story, but one of my teachers that I worked with, he did a homestay in Irvine, actually, in California. And so we connected over where we had been and experiences like that. And we also connected over music. So the first thing was Sam Cooke.
Okay.
We both really enjoyed Sam Cooke. And then he started talking about all these jazz musicians one day. And I hadn't really heard of any of them before. Or if I had heard about any of them, it was just their name. I couldn't tell you anything about Miles Davis or John Coltrane or anyone like that. So.
And were you surprised that in Japan there was this culture of jazz? And it was, I mean, when I went there, just speaking from my experience, I heard it in the coffee shops, in elevators. And I almost didn't think about it because when I'm in an elevator in the US, I hear jazz. And then I realized I'm in Japan. Was that surprising to you? I'm assuming you knew going in.
I would say that at this point, thinking about it now, it's not that surprising, but I think I was a bit surprised that someone from another culture would take so much interest in American culture, and not just, you know, a television show or movies, but kind of this very specific area of music. And I think over time I realized that there is such a devoted culture of hobbies, of music appreciation in Japan. And so jazz is one of the foremost topics that people love to listen to at cafes, search for records in stores, and just everything you can imagine people are invested in, I think.
You listed off those names. Were those the first ones that... And what was this gentleman's name you said introduced you?
Oh, his name is Genji, yeah.
Okay. Were those the ones he introduced you first? Miles Davis, Coltrane?
Yeah, I remember, you know, those two names obviously are big ones. Who else? Well, bebop. So bebop, okay. I can't really explain it that well, but one of the main people is Charlie Parker.
Right.
And so he was one of those where I was like, wow, okay, I have to learn who this person is. And then there were also some pianists like Oscar Peterson and Red Garland, who I don't know if he's as famous, but I really enjoy just his music. It's very light and playful, I think. But those were a couple of the people that he introduced me to early on.
It's funny you said that. Yesterday when I was prepping for this, I told Google Home to play jazz music. First thing it played was Red Garland, If I Were a Bell.
I don't think I actually know that
one. It's actually one of my favorite jazz piano pieces. It starts with that like stereotypical doorbell sound.
Uh-huh.
And I heard it. I took a jazz class actually in college, and that's the only reason when you say these names, I kind of know what you're talking about. Red Garland was one of them, and the bebop section was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
I had never heard anything like it up to that point.
Yeah.
And even in college, I would say I appreciated jazz, but I didn't understand the history of it and how much went into. I mean, if I had heard bebop, I would just say, "Oh, this is jazz music." I wouldn't think this is bebop, a type of jazz music.
Yeah.
And Parker he played the clarinet? No.
Charlie Parker? Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
It shows how bad I am with instruments. I'm just like, I like this sound. But yeah.
If there are any jazz enthusiasts listening, they're just gonna roll their eyes at all the mistakes they're making. It's all over the place. Like, it sounds like he's playing random notes, and I get it when you say it took some getting used to, because it almost doesn't sound like music initially. It's just like he's blowing into the instrument, going up and down scales.
Yeah.
But the amount of skill, as I took the class, realizing the amount of skill it takes is phenomenal. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, and for someone like me who has no background in music or doesn't really understand all of that, all I could comprehend is someone like Charlie Parker or John Coltrane. When you listen to them, it's like the complete antithesis of like a Kenny G, like very mellow and calm and soothing type of sound. It's kind of all over the place, abrupt and very frenetic, and so I think I was sort of drawn to that. Even just in general, I like that.
You mentioned the PBS documentary. You said that was kind of the entry point.
So I actually watched that after returning from Japan.
Okay.
But I think that was good for me because it helped me put context with everything and try and figure out how all the pieces of jazz fit together. Because I don't really have a background in the music. I didn't know that much about it. And so just to get some background on kind of its roots and the culture, how much it's connected with American culture, both, I guess, the inventiveness, but then also, oppression and racism of blacks in America too, and how it's something that's joyful, but it can also reflect, difficult things as well. And even something small like Louis Armstrong, I feel like a lot of people know him from maybe a couple of his songs or one of his performances.
Right.
But I realized he was such a crucial figure early on to jazz and what we come to know as jazz. And there are so many other people they bring up, and some of them I'll forget the names of, but just to see how the music evolved and how it reflected the culture at that time too, I think was cool to see in that documentary.
Do you think there was something about your time in Japan that really spurred this on, or simply because it was big there and you had a lot of free time, the pieces just sort of came together?
I think so. Part of my job, they always said we were supposed to be like cultural ambassadors, or, if you're in another culture, you want to represent your culture well or make bonds and connections with other people. So I think I'm naturally curious about things, and I'm always trying to build relationships. And since Japanese wasn't my first language, it was, oh, this person likes baseball, so let's talk about that. Oh, this person likes this type of American food, or, oh, this teacher likes jazz music. Okay, that's a point that we can connect on. And so for me, that was a foundation of a relationship that I built when I was in Japan.
Can you think of a story, a moment when you were there where things might maybe clicked, or you're listening to a song, walking to work, and you thought there's really something here with jazz music?
Yeah. I don't know if I can think of a specific song necessarily. There are a lot that I just really enjoyed during that time. But one of the highlights definitely for me, my teacher that I worked with and myself, we both went to a jazz club.
Nice.
In a place called Kichijoji. It's a city in Tokyo. It's known to be really good for families, but probably dating back to the 60s or 70s, it was very famous for all of the jazz clubs there. And so if you leave the station in Kichijoji and just kind of wander around the streets and step in this sort of underground back alleyway with this sign, you'll come to this cafe that's underground. And we actually saw, I think, a trio play. And it was all bebop music.
Wow.
So we had just a great seat in this pretty intimate venue. And we just got to listen to them just go off. And usually when I listen to jazz music, I like to have maybe shorter songs. Like, my patience for longer songs isn't that great.
Yeah.
But when you're in a live venue, there was something pretty amazing about having the improvising and the camaraderie of the musicians playing off each other. It was actually pretty fun and exhilarating to experience.
And I'm thinking from someone listening who grew up in the US, they're thinking, okay, jazz club, but in Japan. Is there a vibe that is very unique to Japan? Maybe even, I don't know, the ambiance or the way things are run, or does it almost seem like this is a US jazz club and they're almost trying to become like an American jazz club?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've never been to a jazz club in the US, so I can't really speak to that. I will say it's sort of an unassuming environment, right? Because if you just step out on the street, you're back in Tokyo, and you have street vendors and shops and all those things. But if you go down these steps, you're in this little underground space, and there are Japanese salarymen with their drinks probably after work, and they just want to listen to some music, or some older people, probably retired people, who go to every one of these concerts and know everything about jazz probably. And then someone like me who got brought there and was just trying to be open to the environment and the experience, and just enjoy something different. So
it would be hilarious if we went to a, say, I don't know, an LA jazz club, and you walked in and you thought, this is not even close to being as cool as Japan. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I don't know. You never know.
Towards the end of what you wrote, this is the part that really intrigued me. You talked about Coltrane, and I never knew this. You talked about his spiritual influence and how that is seen in his music. How you said he signed many of his pieces Soli Deo Gloria, like Bach did. I remember listening to Coltrane in my jazz class, and I always go back to this one class because it's just my single exposure to jazz. And our professor ended the class with Coltrane. That was the last lecture. And it was his way of saying, this is almost like the epitome of what's out there.
Wow.
Like, this man is brilliant.
Wow.
And he hyped it up so much, and I remember sitting there like, I'm about to hear the Mozart of jazz. Yeah. Which is probably true in many ways. This is a hot take, but I didn't really like it. Yeah. And because I didn't get it. Yeah. And he didn't mention any of the spiritual aspects he said. There was just a lot of explanation of techniques and, I mean, how long it was and things like that. But I look back, and if I had known maybe more about his story and more about the way he was writing it, I would have had a deeper appreciation for it. what about Coltrane would you say intrigues you, and about this whole spiritual influence that he's had?
Wow, that's an awesome question. I think I'm intrigued by Coltrane partially because it's so closely connected, or his legacy seems so closely connected with Japan. Because he died, I think, in about 1966 or so. And it just so happened one of his last tours was through Japan. And so it's kind of considered, his last waltz, his final show before he died. And so it's taken on a kind of mythic status, I think, for jazz lovers. And I actually did some digging on this just because I was interested. But there was a famous jazz columnist or critic who asked him, where do you want to be in 10 or 20 years, Mr. Coltrane? And he responded something like, I want to be a saint. And I think he was making a joke because he didn't know, he didn't know that he would be dead the next year or anything like that, right?
How old was he at this point?
Ooh, I want to say he was probably only in his 40s or so, but maybe a little older. So not that old. But if he was making a joke, I'm not sure if it translated in Japanese that well. And so they took it very seriously. And so after he passed away, it was like, well, maybe he is a saint now, like with all the music that he's put into the world. Things like Love Supreme that have fairly overt spiritual and almost psalm-like parts to them. So I was just kind of fascinated by that side of him. I don't necessarily think I connect with all of his beliefs probably, or even if he had a theology, I'm not really sure what that would be like.
Right.
But I was just fascinated that he did have this spiritual side that he was trying to connect his music to and merge those two together.
When you listen to his music, do you feel different, say, compared to listening to Parker or Davis or Armstrong?
I feel like I haven't tried to listen to it or listen to Coltrane in that kind of context. Like, I'm not really looking at it for a spiritual experience per se. So I'm looking or listening for enjoyment's sake. So I don't know if I could say that I have a overtly different experience listening to his music. But that being said, I'm just interested in how someone would try and make jazz or create something that reflects their beliefs or their faith. Because so often we think you need words or you need to mention God's name or things like that, which are all good.
Right.
But there seems to be something more elemental about what he's doing.
Continuing off of that, which was my favorite part of what you sent me, you asked, and I'll just read it off here. In related to Coltrane and why he wrote what he did, you said, what makes music Christian, or how do we codify it? Are these categories totally arbitrary, or can they be helpful? This is what intrigued me most. And maybe if you could somehow find the way to connect that back to the I used to think statement, how would you answer your own question? I mean, what makes music spiritual, or what makes it even overtly Christian? What do you think?
Yeah. That's another huge question. I'm sure we could talk about it for a long time, but I think something I've been thinking about recently is if you have some sort of belief in God or some sort of relationship with God or belief in Him, it's sort of a one-to-one thing in that no one else can be the one to say like, oh, you are a Christian, or you believe this, you believe that. It is purely something relational between you and God, that God knows if you believe in Him and are following Him. Maybe others can see it by the fruit that's in your life, things that you do, the way you act. But it's really just that relationship almost. And, your life, hopefully, if you believe this, like glorifying God in certain ways. So if we take that to music, and if we understand that to be true or something like that, then any type of music that we make, it seems like if our hearts are in a place of humility and wanting to glorify God, it seems like that music would be, if not Christian by genre, it's made by someone who is a Christian or believes in God. And so that is going to have some effect, I think, on what they create. There's just no way around that for that person.
What I'm hearing then is, even for Coltrane, who I'm sure his followers wouldn't, I mean, I can't truly say, but yeah. I don't know if he confessed to be a Christian or his followers saw him as a Christian. But based on that logic, I mean, Coltrane's music could be, if he was writing it, like you said, with the intention of, I don't know how you would word it, glorify God or point to a deity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to say, because I even think about that. I mean, these are modern, maybe kind of silly examples, but people like Justin Bieber and Kanye West, like I want those people to, have a relationship with God, and I don't really know where they're at because there's so many distractions for them. But just trusting that, that God, if it's His will pursue them. And I can't speak to Coltrane as well. Like, I don't know anything about his life or personal things like drugs and maybe other things that happened in his life. But, it just kind of comes back to that. It's a relationship between that person and God. And you can try and encourage other people, exhort other people. But it is a very personal thing, I think.
Right. I like how you said it's, in the end, one-to-one with God. We might have had this conversation before, and I don't remember if I mentioned it, but I have always struggled with what we deem as Christian. You said before that music, you could say a genre is Christian, and I think that's appropriate, because otherwise what else would you call it?
Yeah.
And you mentioned that before with movies. And I'm okay with that, simply because it needs to have some kind of categorization. I mean, Spotify needs something.
Yeah.
In order to put it in a certain algorithm. The trouble I've always had was, so I grew up in a Christian high school, and the narrative was always, this is a Christian school. Our curriculum is Christian. Our equipment is Christian. And it got to a point where it can almost be confusing whether the curriculum and the environment itself supported Christians. I don't know if that's what people meant, or is created by Christians. Because when I hear Christian, I think, like you were saying, it is something that happens to someone. A test or a quiz that a teacher gives itself cannot be Christian. It's an inanimate object. I don't know if I'm going too nitpicky here. And it always bothered me, because how can I be a Christian and I feel a relationship with God and I have spiritual experiences, and yet at the same time, like our basketball team, our gym is a Christian.
Yeah.
And it almost seemed problematic for me. Like you said, this could be an entirely different podcast.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think about the title of this podcast, I Used to Think, and I wonder how this could challenge listeners to think, what do I deem as Christian or even spiritual? Because it can be so easy to label things, and all of a sudden that label means it's good or perfect in a certain way. When Coltrane created something and it's good in its own way, and people might put a standard on it and say that can't be Christian, because like you said, it doesn't have overt Christian words in it. It doesn't say the word savior or grace or sin.
Yeah.
But
if it's beautiful, right? If something's beautiful or good, then it seems like that reflects a God or creator or someone who made things around us. So and if we believe that God made everyone, even non-Christians, right, have the capacity to make beautiful things. So that should give us a lot of freedom, I think.
Right. I like that it has something good. It's inherently good, not because it fits a certain mold or standard. So looking back to your moment of transitioning, I mean, jazz, I guess, wasn't even on your radar. Or if it was, like you said, it felt boring. Or Elevator, Kenny G. What kind of mindset does it take in order to switch from that? To switch from, this is something that I'm not really interested in, to, I mean, you wrote an entire outline on it early in the morning, and you're doing a podcast on it. Is it just openness? Do you think it takes a teacher to be there to really walk you through how it's beautiful, how it's valuable, the history of it, or is there a secret formula to like really being open-minded?
Wow. That's really good. I feel like it's either all of the above or whatever you need. Like, everyone might be different. Maybe you go to a concert and you're like, wow, that was really good. What was that? Or for me, it was a teacher who was just really excited about it and shared musicians that I may have known the names of or didn't know at all, but I was curious enough to go to YouTube, go to Spotify, and type in some names and listen to some songs. And either over time or very quickly came to appreciate and enjoy listening to some of them. So I feel like everyone might be a little different, but I think it's definitely nice to have someone else that you can walk alongside and get to enjoy it with. Because otherwise, if I hadn't gone to Japan or if I hadn't met someone who was so interested in jazz, I definitely would have never connected with it, at least the way I did, I think. So
that's awesome. And we could do a whole other episode of just how much Japan changed you and influenced you. But I love how it was more than just, I love how it enhanced a part of American culture.
Yes.
That you were there.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you were exposed to almost a new angle, a new light of a deep part of American culture, I would argue. I mean, jazz, you can trace country music back to jazz. You can trace rock music back to jazz. That is the part that is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
It almost takes coming out of something to really understand home or where you're from. And that's an awesome thing. Yeah. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the very first episode of the I Used to Think podcast. Tyne and I really enjoyed having this conversation. As you might be able to tell, we're not jazz experts, but we love talking about music and talking about learning new things. Take some time to review, rate, subscribe, follow the podcast, all of the above. and I hope to bring some new episodes out to you guys soon. Until next time, peace.